Hey, good afternoon, Tim. I was just looking. I forgot that we were doing culture today, and I do some reading this week. But this is promising, I think, to be an interesting topic. What do you think?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I'm fascinated by organizations and groups and how they create these unwritten rules and laws. I think we have an opportunity to talk about many interesting things here.
You know, what's interesting from my own background, and you and I may have talked about this in the past, but I was raised in a farming community, but it was a community that was settled much from Europe. And so the diversity of the cultures of the people groups, I'll call it that. We had Czech immigrants, and I think I was second or maybe third generation, depending on how you wanted to place my parents on which side of the ocean at the time that they were born. But we had Czech immigrants, we had Ukrainian immigrants, we had German immigrants, and then we had British immigrants. And each one of these people groups culturally brought with them their own customs, their own art, their own ways of celebrating. In fact, I remember having two holidays around the Christmas season, one that we all celebrated, and then the Ukrainian kids had a whole different Christmas celebration that we were allowed to celebrate with them. So culturally, from a people group perspective, I was indoctrinated in the process or the thought process when I was young. And yet here's the interesting thing. We were all farmers. And so there was a general culture of the farming, the thought process around responsibility, the thought process around work ethic to get the seed in, to get the harvest off, even though we were different people groups. So it's interesting how we had culture that was larger than the cultures.
Yes, yes. This is what fascinates me. You can have engineers and admins and you can have decision makers and you can have janitors, and they all have their own little group that with their rules. But then when they get in the big organization, they have the big organization rules, and somehow they work together. It really it it makes me think about what is culture and why do we even have it.
Well, and then when I thought about that, as I thought about this subject sometime during this week, it also occurred to me that as I grew up in my consulting career as a project manager in various parts of the country, I did one of my first projects in the state of Alaska. And following the state of Alaska, shortly thereafter, I did some work in northern Florida, which is sort of like southern Georgia in terms of the cultural aspects. And then from there, I went to Hawaii. Now, interestingly enough, an IT project is an IT project. And yet every single one of those cultural norms that we were immersed in as a result of our location influenced what we did on the project greatly.
So we're using this word culture. How can we use it without really defining it? We know it tacitly, right? We have
Yeah.
a sense of what it is, but how can we actually describe it so we agree we're talking about the same thing?
Well, I came across an interesting read, and that was think about this from an organizational standpoint. Think of it as the personality of the organization. I like that
Oh,
definition. Isn't
I
that good?
like that.
Yeah.
I like that. That's a good one. It's something to do with the character and the behavior then, because that's what personality is. Here's one for you. This comes from a guy by the name of Storty, and he wrote a book called Understanding the World's Cultures. Now, again, we're talking about, different national and different traditional cultures, um, shared assumptions, values, and beliefs, which result in character behavior. So they have the same assumptions, values, and beliefs that result in them behaving in a similar manner.
Well, and if you think of what I just kind of came across with that personality of an organization, very much a shared set of workplace beliefs and values and attitudes and standards and the kinds of things that we bring to have a common experience on the project so that we can together come up with the final end result for our client. And so it is, I like the word shared. I think that's important.
Yes, yes, yes. And think about this. If we were a leader and we had some influence over the culture, boy, we would have power. We'd be able to, quote unquote, create that servant leadership environment where people would really want to get work done. They feel motivated, they feel empowered, they feel like they can share ideas and they won't get shot down.
Well, and part of that too, and I think that this may be something we can kind of examine during this podcast, but the other thought process, what you just kind of laid out there, is it's if we as leaders have that ability to influence that greatly, and I do believe we do, it comes almost as a series of unwritten rules, if I can use that term, unwritten rules that come perhaps because of our leadership influence.
Yeah, let me share something with you on those unwritten rules, and this is what's scary. Okay, if you take organizational behavior in business school, they always teach you a story. This is a cautionary tale. Okay, this is something that we would repeat in this day and age, but there was a behavioral psychologist and a research professor called B.F. Skinner, Dr. Skinner. He was the bane of all monkeys on the planet. He did a lot of experiments on them, not medical experience, but behavioral. And one of his was basically on culture and how resilient culture is. He took a bunch of monkeys and put them in a cage, and they didn't know each other, but they gradually learned to behave and learn as a group. They shared bananas, they groomed each other, and all those kind of things, right? And he had his TAs slowly change the environment over time. One time he added a ladder in the cage, and then another time he put a rope on a hook that was just out of reach on the above the ladder. So the monkeys got real curious whenever they started doing these things. And one day somebody hung bananas on that rope, one of the TAs. And then the monkeys started getting really excited. But the moment one of the monkeys jumped on the ladder to get a bunch of bananas, one of the TAs outside the cage would spray all the monkeys with water. Well, you do that enough and all the monkeys start learning that this is really bad. And whenever a monkey from then on got close to the ladder, the rest of the monkeys started self-policing and beat each other up. Now, it gets even weirder. Over the next few months, they rotated out the monkeys and they removed the bananas, okay? And so sooner or later, there were a bunch of monkeys who had never known there were bananas above the ladder. But whenever they got near the ladder, or a monkey did get near the ladder, all the rest of the monkeys would beat them up, and they wouldn't know why. They just said that ladder is bad. And this is the power of culture. We don't know why we have these unwritten rules, but we have them.
That's fascinating. But I'm just trying to, as you were talking about it, I was trying to think back to some of my early projects, whether we behaved like some of those monkeys.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure.
Yeah, and have you ever heard somebody said it's always been done that way, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the bane of a project manager.
Yeah, that's the banana ladder.
Yeah.
That's the banana ladder. It's always been done that. But what they're admitting to is they don't know why.
Yeah.
They don't know why. They're doing extra things and there's no benefit.
Well, I just got off a call just before this podcast. I'm doing some advisory work for a client, and that essentially came through. I offered them some advice in terms of how they should set up their governance process, and they hearkened back to how they did previous projects. Well, there's a clue there. Perhaps some of the previous projects were less successful because they didn't try something different, because they've always done it that way. So let me ask you this, based on this, how is it that culture can get in the way of how it is that we work?
Well, I think we found one thing.
Yeah.
We found we have to make a change, but it's always been known that way. Which one is going to win out?
Yeah, and it's, it's always one of those things where you're always comfortable in the way it's always been done, right? So people don't like to
Yeah.
get out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius said, it's hard for me to get out of the warm covers. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what he was talking about. It's hard for us to step out of these old habits and behaviors, even if they are what is holding us back.
Well, I was thinking as I asked you that question, there's some very, very obvious situations I know I've been in. I remember one time on a project, someone going forward to meet with the CEO of the client company, and somebody said, "Hey, break a leg." And we had people on the project who were from a different culture nationally. And they thought, why would you tell him to break a leg? What is going on? And so
Right.
even just language barriers or idiomatic expression barriers can be a cultural enough difference that it can cause problems on a project, or at least hiccups.
Or even something inside of a national culture, like code freeze. Why would I freeze code? I talked to an admin for over 45 minutes who said, I don't get it. Why you're talking about making changes. Now you're saying we don't need changes. Which one is it?
Yeah,
I said,
which one?
it's both.
Well, this is funny because I was on a project once. We were having to test. We're doing some system testing, internal system testing, and I had several people on my project that were nationally from a different culture. Now, they had culturally done very well within our project culture, but there were still some things that were weird. And the test case that I had asked this one young man to test was that of ensuring that we could deal with a pregnancy situation for an unwed mother. And he refused to do it. And I asked him, why are you refusing to test that situation? And he said, because it's impossible. Because in his culture, it was so frowned upon that he had not experienced a situation like that. So he thought it was silly to test for something like that. He had not gone back to the requirements of the system, which was why we were testing. But it was an interesting thought that, culturally, we can get in the way of ourselves if we don't explain ourselves more easily to those people who are working with us.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Now that's one side of the discussion.
Yeah.
And it can get in the way of our work easily.
Yeah.
Do you think also culture and understanding culture can put us at an advantage?
Oh, I think so. I know from my own experience having a lot of diversity on projects, both male, female, different language groups, different nationalities, made things very much more interesting. When we dealt with the project situations, I even liked some of the way some of the thinking processes people brought with them that we had not been exposed to, and it helped our problem solving come through much quicker.
Oh, you bet. You bet. Diversity in context, diversity in background creates very innovative thinking, especially when you realize it's, people connecting with people that creates new knowledge, and it's people connecting with information that creates new knowledge too. And that's what you get when you overlap cultures.
Yeah, I remember on several projects, one of them where I was the only American or the only Westerner who had gone for dinner with my entire team. And I was exposed to a type of food that I had never experienced before. And not only was it an interesting experience having dealt with that, having tasted that food and eaten that way, but from then on, we had a different camaraderie in the project. There was a much more cooperative, collaborative process because I had experienced something new, and they were pleased that I was willing to experience something new as part of where they came from. So again, that helped with moving the project forward because we were all cooperating and collaborating in a much different way.
Oh yeah, team building. One of the greatest team building activities is eating, especially eating family style.
Yeah.
It really, really causes people to transcend what, what they perceive as other cultures, and they realize, it's not multiple cultures here. It's the human culture that we can celebrate. There's another advantage we can have. If we can actually set a new group on their path early, like in the kickoff of a project, and we can establish, some aspects of culture. I'm not saying all of it, but if we can establish some of these norms, we're going to treat each other right. We're going to be open. If we're not going to argue, we're going to debate. And we're not going to call people wrong. We're going to call ideas inappropriate. And it sounds like we're spinning, but and this is what I do on my kickoffs. It's not spinning. This is not a spin. This is actually a different mindset, and a culture can actually be established that's outside any of the individual's experience.
It absolutely can. I distinctly remember one project that we were flailing a little bit. I mean, we weren't serious trouble, but we were flailing, and we had, much like you had talked about, we had developed that feeling of respect and working together and that sort of thing. But we had a project manager whose entire attitude was, we can do this. No, it's more like, we've got this. And as he continued to infuse that process, that enthusiasm, that motivation, that feeling of success, the team caught on. And it was an unwritten rule. Nobody put it in the handbook that we've got this, but because of his enthusiasm, the rest of the team kind of thought, well, yeah, we do have this. And it's amazing how much more quickly we caught up to the schedule and actually got ahead.
Yes, it's magic. And it's not fake it until you make it. There's something about somebody in authority having trust and embracing trust, even before trust is earned.
Yeah.
To be able to say, I have your back. And we know this as individuals, right? Yeah. I have your back. This is one of the strongest things you can tell your friend. Don't worry. Call me up at 2 a.m. Tell me where I need to be. Tell me what I need to bring. And that is one of the most powerful statements you can give a friend, but it's one of the most powerful statements a leader can give a group.
Well, in that example that I just gave, I remember this particular individual at 9 o'clock one evening, as someone was struggling with their programming assignment to get it done on time. That project manager, that enthusiastic, we got this project manager, sitting next to him, looking over his code with him, with the programmer, and coming through, and they hit the solution. Now, how many times would you say, why is a high-priced, high-paid project manager sitting with a programmer working on a difficult solution? It's because we got this.
Because we have this. Yeah. We know the magic.
Yeah.
We know the magic. And to instill that in a culture, if people observe us doing this enough time, they start behaving in the same way. All of a sudden, we have another banana ladder here in the room, except it's not a negative banana ladder.
Well, and think of that young programmer. He was, a lot of people are scared, they're afraid of the criticism that comes from on high. And here they had the project manager sitting next to them, encouraging them and actually going through the code with them. That was almost unheard of from a programmer's perspective.
So back in 2014, I was starting to get a lot of international students, and they were very respectful. They always apologized for getting a question wrong. And they always said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And it was like they were saying, I'm sorry for thinking this way. And I'm thinking to myself, you've never been introduced to any other way of thinking. This is not you being wrong. And it took me like 3 years to figure out, you know what? These guys need to start off with some different assumptions, values, and beliefs. So I created ground rules or a team charter for my class. And one of them was nobody's wrong or right. We all have opinions and perceptions, and we measure them by the value of the opinion and perception. And what we believe today may not be tomorrow, because we may learn something better between today and tomorrow. And starting with that, and then repeating that 3 or 4 times from each class, all of a sudden, these people turned from being sorry to contesting all of my ideas. And I'm thinking, what have I created? But at the same time, I was creating an environment where people felt safe. They felt safe to raise their voices and question. And again, like you said, it's never been done that way. It is so pervasive that it's like an unspoken truth that we live with.
Well, and think about what you just described. You described the way of culturally bringing it. It was a project culture, bringing them together culturally so that they could collaborate in that fashion. I remember going in and doing a project review on a failing project at one point. I was the reviewer, and I noticed all of these little cells of people who were just kind of unto themselves and working individually, and there was no team camaraderie. There was no rah, let's make this happen. There was no thought process of how am I going to hit the deadlines. It was just kind of every person for themselves. And so that's a direct opposite of what you just described. And you can see the difference between the success that one creates and the failure that results from the other.
And the problem is we are so programmed to be competitive. And we play a game in business called zero sum, which means for every winner, there has to be a loser. And we play that game over and over again. We don't realize the damage that causes to the group. And it's only after we actually observe that for a while that we start saying, you know, there's a better way to approach this.
Well, I think I've shared this with you before, but I had a manager who would look at that kind of behavior and say, you know what you guys are engaging in? You're talking about, hey, Tim, your end of the boat is sinking. I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? If you're not culturally programmed to work together.
Oh, I love that. That's great, Merv. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there's an opposite game called non-zero sum. And that opposite game is how can we keep that boat floating? And that's more important.
Yeah. And how can we keep it floating together? You bail, you row, whatever it takes to make it happen. But assign it out, don't duplicate, and just keep going. But again, we're talking about culture and how do you infuse that culture? And I think back a few minutes ago, we talked about us as leaders being that influential perspective on the project that causes others, not by our writing things in a handbook or talking about them in a meeting, but just by leading by example.
Yeah. Repeating something, repeating simple phrases, like you said, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. Repeating until everybody hates when you say it. Because when everybody hates when you say it, they've heard it enough times to memorize it. Yeah. When they say, don't tell me that again, I say, great. That means that every time I show up, it's going to hop up in your mind and I won't have to say it again.
So how do you think, you've been on a lot of projects, as have I. When do you think you realized how influential culture can be on a project or in an organization?
Wow, this was really wild. So it was back when I was in my first project management work in 1993 through 95. And I was just going to business school. and I read this statement that said, this is Peter Drucker. Basically, culture eats process for breakfast. It means culture wins over process. If you try to change process, if you don't respect culture, it's never going to happen. And I said, wow, that's nice. I wonder why. And then I left this, and it was a transportation company. So they were very proper and they were very on the dime and they were very structured. And it was like, go, 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 right? And then I moved to a state agency as an IT director. And it was like, let's talk about this. Let's think about this. Let's not use the word confrontation. Let's not use the word argue, because we're proper and we don't treat people. And wrong or right, the way these guys figured out how to work together was a functional way they learned how to work together. And neither one of those, fit all situations. And I started seeing where one culture had benefits, the other culture had deficits, and vice versa. And at the same time, I didn't think that we had control over the culture, but I knew it had incredible influence.
That's fascinating. That is interesting. I think mine was, remember I talked earlier about going from Alaska to northern Florida and then to Hawaii.
Yeah.
I think when I really figured it out that this was more than just rules and the PM, the project management, organizational processes and stuff, when I was in the state of Hawaii. And you've heard me talk about this before. What I learned in the state of Hawaii was that not only is it a different ethnic culture in that 50th state, but as they, as we as Western, well, we're all Westerners, but as we from the mainland experienced working with them, it was a different process. They had much more of a feeling of what they call ohana, or family. So they wanted us to work together almost as family. But here's the real interesting thing culturally. Part of that was a unwritten rule, which was inculcated within them, but not within us. And that was to save face. A lot of us who had come from the mainland, we were very assertive on our projects. No matter what, we, take no prisoners, get this done. Well, that did not work in a culture of saving face. And I learned from the Hawaiian people and those that were on our project how incredibly powerful that was in a project. So when I took that thought process back to projects back on the mainland, it's amazing how different I was able to work with my project staff, and how, more importantly, I was able to influence them to work in a different style. It wasn't perfectly save face like the Hawaiian culture, but what a difference on my projects. And so I think that's where I first learned the whole idea that culture is hugely influential on how you work on projects or within an organization.
So culture is this huge thing that's almost impossible to change once it's in. Can you really change culture, do you think?
Can I emphatically say yes?
Oh, please do. Please do.
Well, I've seen projects, and I talked about the project manager I witnessed who said, "We've got this." That was his attitude. I've been in situations where projects were languishing for lack of, and people say this is because of a lack of leadership. Perhaps that's true. But when a different leader came in and brought in a more enthusiastic, more cooperative, collaborative approach to work, and started to instill that in the way they did their work every day, he began to change the culture in a way that people began to succeed more quickly on their tasks and liked it. And so they began to change from this kind of lackadaisical, I'll get it done when I get it done, to this incredible willingness to meet their deadlines and help their counterpart to meet their deadlines as well, so that the entire project crossed the finish line at the same time.
Wow. I have a great example here. A lot of my projects in the mid to late 2000s were bringing in the concept of a data center. Now, think about a corporate data center. You have to find all the applications and all of the data of the corporation that are critical to the function of that corporation. And then you have to centralize and standardize and find some support structure that no matter where the people are in the world, they can still get their job done. Now, if you're talking about a company that has 10,000 to 80,000 people in it, they are entrusting the data that's by their feet when they come in at work in these little network drives, and to be somewhere thousands of miles away. And that's a mindset that's scary. You know, it's mine. It's like, this is my garden. I've been taking care of it and it's precious. And how dare somebody else in a factory farm somewhere else will take care of my little flowers. And that we saw this over and over again. The corporations that were healthiest would take a roadmap of 9 months before the project started to prepare people for this transition in mindset.
I remember something, well, not dissimilar from what you just described, but early in my career, I had joined a consulting company that had been created by the vision of a single person. Well, I think I was employee number 300 or somewhere in that neighborhood.
Wow.
And we had several branches across, in this case, across Canada. And I remember him, the owner of the company who had formed the company, coming out to our branch, and we had a celebratory dinner. And he sat down and spoke with me. He spoke with other young consultants in his company. It was like we were at the beach or something and just kind of talking across the table with each other. My wife was there. It was one of those dinners where the spouses were invited. He talked to her like she was one of the gang. And it was a very family oriented kind of process. Well, years later, we had grown into the billion-dollar kind of size. And he ended up bringing in a chief executive officer from a very aggressive, worldwide, well-known consulting company. This person would not talk to us little people. It was amazing. So culturally, just by bringing in one person in this many thousand employee company, he turned the culture around completely, where several of us, by then I'd been with the company almost 15 years, several of us realized that this was not going to do our careers any good, and we moved on. And that company eventually basically was dismantled and sold for pieces and parts. It was amazing, just by one person changing the culture that dramatically.
Well, management and leadership has the ability to do this so easily. We have this understanding, and this is part of our, you know, our cultural norms or our cultural normal behavior. The leadership sets the tone, and if they say they are disengaged, we're going to behave like our leaders. We're going to be disengaged too. If they say they don't care, we're going to do the same thing, because that's what's expected of us. Yeah. If I see the leader sharpening their sword every night, I'm going to sharpen my sword every night. If I see them drinking before a battle, what am I going to do? And this is the way humans are. We can't get away from it. Like Drucker said, you know, culture is not something that we can manipulate in such an easy manner, but over time, it is a tsunami and will change everything.
Well, and I don't want people listening to my last experience thinking, well, that's a leadership problem, not a cultural problem. Because what I want to say is that what I witnessed on some of our projects, where suddenly project managers were looking at reports and Gantt charts all day long with their door closed and not working with their staff. Whereas previously, many of these same managers had been managing by walking around or wandering around, you know, the old style of management. and actually engaging with their staff. And so it was a cultural change because of a what I would consider a leadership failure.
Yes, and what I would say and what I would explain to my students is, you're right, it's not a manager problem, but it's a management and leadership behavior that creates an issue that focuses on cultural behavior. It triggers things that we don't necessarily have a lot of control over.
Well, and I was thinking even now, and I hadn't thought about this until right now. How has the pandemic, do you think, changed project culture or organizational culture? Because so many of us have been working at home by ourselves. Do you think that has
Oh,
influenced culture?
oh yeah. I I I've done a lot of research on this, and I've looked at a lot of experience of this too. Number one, disengagement. You have to do extra work to engage your remote workers. It the needs of people don't change just because they work from home.
Yeah.
And if they're isolated physically, they're going to be isolated emotionally, and they need that sense of belonging to a group, whether they're face to face or whether they're working from home. And if they have to work from home, that engagement has to be a conscious effort. And it's the leader that demonstrates the accepted behavior, whether we like it or not. And so the leader has to be more engaged and more conscious and more active in engaging each other. And the thing is, it's the leader starts it, but the organization and the group takes the cue from the leader and starts doing it themselves. And once an astute or a mature leader starts seeing this, they say, aha, I can move on to refinement, and I can actually make improvements in this engagement.
Yeah, what I witnessed from projects that I knew very well was that we didn't necessarily lose a lot of the impetus or the going forward with people scattered all over the place in their homes. What we did lose, though, was some of the warmth that comes with engagement one on one. You know, somebody's having a bad day and a colleague comes and gives them a big hug and everything's okay. You can't do that in Zoom. You just can't make that happen. And so culturally, that also affects us. And yet at the same time, I'm reading some disturbing literature that so many people don't want to go back to the office. They're very
Well,
comfortable.
it's not disturbing. It's not disturbing. All of this research, like GitLab, is really big in this area. All of this research that's talking about work from home and how it actually promotes a healthier work-life balance. And one of the things that you've been talking about, but you haven't talked about directly yet, is the fact that if you're going to lead and manage people, you don't just lead and manage the work, you lead and manage the relationships.
Yeah.
It goes hand in hand. It's about the people. And if you don't get the people side right, the work side is never going to be effective.
And I'm embarrassed not having done that because the name of my company is People First Project Management. Thank you for that reminder. That was great. But it's true. It is so true that we have to keep our people engaged and keep them. Well, we have to somehow get that warm, fuzzy engagement back because, you know, when I think about my most rewarding projects, it was the one, it was the, they were the ones where we as a team gelled so well that we became lifelong friends well after the work was done.
See, and that's engagement. Engagement doesn't mean I'm at my desk getting work done. Engagement means I'm motivated. I have a purpose. This work gives me a personal reason. I'm emotionally attached. I care. That's what engagement is. And that's what actually, if you can influence culture, you can create not just one opportunity for one individual to do this, working one-on-one. You can actually start influencing groups of people. And this is where things get really exciting.
So if we can, I mean, you started off the question, you said, can we change culture? Have I convinced you that I believe we can?
Oh yeah, yeah. You didn't have to convince me.
Okay.
I've seen enough experts in this. I am no way an expert. I've observed people who had been doing this for 45 to 60 years as leaders. And these guys just walk into a room. They read the room and they say, huh, huh, huh. And just by, observing a few things and making a small set of adjustments, refinements. These guys are masters at this.
Well, it's interesting as you were mentioning that. So just something as silly as dress, not, well, it's not really silly, but something as basic as a dress code. For most of my consulting years, it was suit and tie. Casual was considered a sports jacket and a pair of slacks and a white shirt and tie, or a colored shirt perhaps and tie. And I distinctly remember I had retired at one point, and then I got an opportunity to come back and work with a company. And I remember walking into the boardroom where the senior management was all there waiting and working on a kind of an idea as to how to work with their client. And I walked in with my suit and tie, and they were all there with open shirts, and I thought, what happened? I've only been retired a year and a half. How did we go from blue suits and white shirts and ties to khakis and open shirts? But culturally, something happened within that organization. I never stopped to think what, but culturally something happened that even the dress code changed.
Well, look at us now. And it's funny. If we have our preference, we're going to be comfortable and relaxed. And all of a sudden, our minds are not preoccupied by color of ties. Yeah. Our minds are preoccupied by how can we get a better idea out on the table.
Well, and think about just what you and I are doing right now. I'm wearing an open shirt, not even a total button down shirt, and my bathing suit, my swimsuit. Because right after this podcast, I'm hitting the pool.
Yeah, and me, I'm totally casual, and I've been blessed. I've been able to do this since 2012, and I remember back in 2005 or 6 when I'd go into a PMP prep class, everybody was suit and ties. Yeah. But now, we're eating dinner. It's not disrespectful though. We're laid back and we're focused and we're attentive. And this is an opportunity for us to observe a societal change that we're going through, partly pandemic and partly because of the change in our perception of how we represent our personal values.
Yeah. I think when you said we're laid back, I think what you probably were trying to get across was we're much more comfortable in the way we are, because our focus is still as much as it ever was.
Yeah, we're more casual in the way we represent ourselves. We're not as formal, and that's exactly what I mean.
So you made an interesting statement a few minutes ago about some of these senior managers who've been around for a while, can walk in and kind of read the room. So when you walk into a room, how do you think we can gain an understanding of perhaps the culture of that organization? If let's say we're new to a project or new to an organization and we walk into a room where several people are there, how do you think we can tell just the nature of that, of the culture of that organization?
Consulting 101, okay? Number one, before you go into the room, go to the break area. Okay? Perfect. Go to the bulletin board. It's going to have the safety. It's going to have all the exit doors. If you need to leave in an emergency, that's good to know. But it's going to have other things. Are they talking about potlucks? Are they talking about stuff outside of work or only inside of work? Are they talking about this is our product life cycle? And if they're sharing these things, do we take a formal approach to our business? Do we or do we just take a tacit approach to our business? Everything is a clue and a cue. The way things are laid out, the way the offices are laid out. Do we have conference rooms in the center? And do we have our cubicles out on the wall, on the windows? everything is going to tell you. And when you get in the room, then you're collecting the body language, who's mimicking who's mirroring who. You have the clothing and you have the discipline versus the casual clothing. You have the little cliques and groups. Are they aligned with technology or knowledge or organization? All of these can actually see how the culture is. Do we have admins talking to engineers, talking to attorneys, talking to finance people, or are they all talking amongst themselves and not sharing information as a group? And it's wonderful to lay out a plate of fruit and see how that changes if they haven't been talking.
Plate of fruit. We used to do banana nut muffins.
Yeah,
Because that was more indulgent, right?
Well, and again, you're by doing that, you're transitioning the culture from a formal information sharing to an informal, nutrition and eating ceremony. And all of a sudden people are confused and they start going to their default state. And this is a really good opportunity for you to read people in their natural setting.
Yeah, I've got several examples of much of what you just spoke about. I remember coming on fairly new onto a project, doing what you just said, looking at the bulletin board. Apparently there was someone on the project whose job it was to pin the latest Far Side cartoon onto the bulletin board.
Oh, brilliant.
So people would pass by the bulletin board and they would stop. They would take a look. They would talk about it later on.
Yeah, and this is fun. This is fun. Why do people do this? That it's funny. There's two classes of thought. First of all, the Inuit Indians up in Alaska, they have 16 different words for what we call snow. Okay. Yeah. We call it snow. They say, no. There's the wet white stuff and the dry white stuff. There's the crunchy stuff in balls, and then there's the powdery stuff that flips up when the wind comes. And it's not all snow. They're different things. And when you go into an organization, you get the terminology and you start looking and you start dissecting how people use words and terms and phrases. And this is one way a leader can actually influence culture, is by establishing a formal lexicon on the project.
And another project I was on, they set up a coffee bar and every morning had donuts or bagels or something delivered. And it was interesting. The coffee bar was right next to the executive assistant. And it was a she in this case, she was able to interact with both project staff and client staff alike. And she got to know the lay of the land. So she was able to very quickly talk to the rest of us about what was going on in the project, because she judiciously put the coffee bar next to her desk.
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. That person knows how to actually connect and network. Yeah. That's brilliant. And creating an environment where people get accidentally kicked out of their cultural norms, you'll find out how people behave in their innate nature. And if you are an astute leader, you can read individuals within that, and you can say, this person is resilient, this person is not resilient. And you can start placing them, not just by skill set, but by their ability to recover from accidents, mistakes, and trauma.
Well, and I learned probably halfway through my career, and I would advise any young project manager listening to us at this point to learn the whole process of reading body language. And not in a way that, just because someone has crossed arms means they're angry or doubtful. That doesn't always, you have to read it kind of within context. I may cross my arms like this because the room is cold. So there's ways of dealing with that, but it's interesting. I can walk into a boardroom and within 5 to 10 minutes, probably get a real good feel for the lay of the land, the culture, who's what, who's the funny person, who's the person in charge, whether or not their title says they're in charge. I mean, it doesn't take long if you learn to read the body language
Yeah, and communication too.
and
I would
communicate.
put communication and body language. Well, body language is a form of communication.
Yeah.
Now, it's funny about communication too. There's two things. Number one, how silence is used,
Yeah.
and how we use silence in different cultural settings across the globe. Silence is a common experience. In the West here, silence means I'm uncomfortable.
It does. Yes.
And
Go ahead.
yeah, and actually silence can be respectful too. There's another side to this. When the leader speaks, that's the end of the conversation. Now, that's true for all humans. When you as a leader make a definitive statement, everybody thinks the decision's been made.
Yeah.
So this expands way beyond culture. So if you observe who's making a statement just before the conversation turns, you get to find out who the real leaders are and who the real decision makers are.
Yeah. You know, your point on silence is so well taken, because often when there is silence, someone feels the need to fill that silence in. And I worked once for a very senior project manager, very wise man, very capable man. And it's amazing. So what would happen was people would direct the question to him and he would pause. And he would pause for probably 5 to 10 seconds, which is interminably long in conversation. But because he was the senior project manager, this is the one time that no one interrupted with their own thoughts. And I would get uncomfortable for him, thinking you're taking way too long. You're not coming across, in a way that we expect a leader to come across with an immediate answer. But what I learned after a couple of weeks was that his long pauses were formulating the way he wanted to present the answer, and often in a way that was very, to kind of cut back on the controversial nature or the conflicting nature of what he was about to respond with. He wanted to protect the other person's dignity, but at the same time give a firm response. And so that 5 seconds, 10 was probably too long, but 5 seconds probably was enough for him to formulate his response, get his words right. And in that case, silence was golden, not uncomfortable.
Yeah, if you know what's going on. There's a Latin phrase for that called festina lente, which means hasten slowly.
Very
Take
good.
your time.
Yeah, take your time.
Slow down, think it through, take a breath. There's another way I use this to my advantage in interviews when I was interviewing somebody. And when I gave them a question and they answered, and I just stood there and kept on listening, then they got uncomfortable and they'd give me more information and more information and more information. It was like sometimes they would be giving me too much information. It's a devious way of using this, but it's incredibly effective.
So that's a situation where you're using something we in the West culturally all understand, but using it for your advantage or what on a project, and maybe even infusing that into the project culture.
Right. And yeah, it's that patience. The way we think is really weird, and it's always been this way. We don't read, we scan. We don't analyze. We pull something out of our back pocket based on our emotional response.
Yeah.
And it takes years for us to train our minds. And we've been struggling with this for thousands of years.
So have you ever been in a situation where the cultural norms or that conflict with your personal values?
Oh, yeah.
You might have handled those situations.
Yeah, I was lucky. I was lucky 2 times. Number one time, I was not the recipient of the message. Somebody much more mature and much stronger than me actually handle this, and I thought they handled it very effectively. The director of a certain agency told one of my friends who was the controller, you take the hit. We know we've been doing this for years this way, and we know it wasn't illegal, but it was wrong. But if you take the hit and you get fired, we'll find you a better job that'll pay you $20,000 a year more somewhere else. And you don't have to worry about anything. And that job is safe and it's always secured for you.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And I was thinking, wow, somebody who actually is asking somebody to ignore their personal values. And that scares me. I've always been, if you break your personal values, you're like a ship without an anchor and you're doomed. Doesn't matter how many people are rowing, that ship is not going anywhere. And I don't know what I would have been able to do. This was back when I was 28 or 29, and I didn't have enough life behind me to make those type of decisions.
Yeah, think about that. That would be a tough call for a lot of people. And
Well,
yet,
yeah, and that is tough. Here's one that was tough for me, and this happened back in 2012. I made an agreement that said if I cannot move to another part of the country, I'll find another job within 6 months. And I communicated that, and I had to be holding up to my word. And it created a devastating loss for my family and my lifestyle. I can live on beans, on the floor without a mattress, but I can't ask my family to do that. And it caused trauma for all of us. But you know what? It's not the events, and this is what happened to me. It's not the events that happen to you, it's the way you respond to them.
yeah.
And I learned through that experience how important it is to stand up and make those statements. And when you do make those statements, follow through, even if it creates personal misfortune or it sets you back.
Well, and it could cost you, depending on how resolved you are. And by the way, for anyone who's listening to us at this point, I think that's the way to handle situations where culture may get in the way of your own ethical dilemma. And I think that is to resolve ahead of time how you will handle any situation. So
That's
that
why
when
we Yeah, that's why we have a team charter.
yeah,
That's why we have these discussions at the kickoff. So before we get into an argument, we know how to treat people well and even make an argument a celebration in innovation.
yeah. And I distinctly remember as a younger person and back, things have changed even in consulting from back then to now. But I remember back in my early years, we had this motto, work hard, play hard. And often people use the word play hard, meaning let's go out to the bars and get hammered every night. And let's see who is strong enough to show up for a client meeting at 7 a.m. and be on their feet and conduct themselves professionally. Well, I had resolved ahead of time that alcohol is not one of my needs. And so I'd
Right.
resolved ahead of time that I was not going to participate in that. Now, it meant that in some situations, I personally was ostracized
Mhm.
and not invited to certain things, but it just did not make sense to me. So my ethical values, and I wasn't, by the way, and I'm no prude, but I wasn't imparting my ethical values on them. I just, for myself, did not participate. And so
Yeah.
as a result of that, I resolved ahead of time that would not happen.
And there are ways to communicate that to people so that they don't feel ostracized. This is what I learned. I created some really stringent values for myself.
Yeah.
And I learned, like you, talk about it early. This is the way I act. I'm not asking you to act this way, but I found value in acting this way. And it's not a statement on you. Me doing this doesn't make you wrong.
Exactly.
It's just something I personally believe in. And all of a sudden, culturally, people may say that's not my value, but at the same time, they say we respect values themselves. And that is where we can connect and we can have the bigger connection to the culture.
Yeah. Well, I could go on for another hour, but I think we need to probably pull this to an end. But I think this whole discussion, not being so linear as to a single thought process around culture, but on the project, but to bring in cultural influences, whether it's national or regional or the way we were raised or whatever it is. I think this all has a bearing. I've enjoyed today's discussion. I've learned a few things.
Oh, so have I. So have I. And honestly, projects are made of human beings, and we cannot ignore these human characteristics. Like you said, people first. There's that human and group behavior that if we ignore it, will rise up and remind us that it has more influence than we can actually ignore.
Yeah, that's very good. I've enjoyed today. Let's sign off and think about what we want to talk about next week, because we always, at least for myself, come up with something that is fascinating to think about during the week. And then I'm not quite sure what's going to come out of my mouth when we actually get onto the podcast.
That's the beautiful thing. So where can we find you, Merv?
Easily on LinkedIn as Merv Jersak, or as People First Project Management.
Excellent. And I can be found over at LinkedIn as well right now.
All right, perfect. All right, until next week, signing off.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great week.